So thanks everybody for joining us today for Creating Value from Data. If you're unfamiliar with 173 Tech, we're a London-based analytics agency who help growing companies around the world to leverage data. We augment busy teams to help them centralize, analyze, and activate data from across the customer journey. We're quite lucky in that we work with companies of all shapes, sizes, and sectors. That means we see problems across a diverse client range. And as well as working for more than 40 companies, we speak to hundreds of companies every year, actually over 400 companies we've spoken to. And we're quite nice in that we give a lot of advice to people, even if they might not be customers to us. So as part of our 5-year anniversary, what I've done is I've gone through literally everybody that we've spoken to, and I've tried to find some sort of key challenges, some key learning points around starting with data, strategy, technology, and people. And what you're going to see is the reasons that people came to us, and then a follow-up and what happened to those companies. And the format that we're going to have is that for each section, I'm going to go through sort of the problems that we've seen and what we found was the actual root cause to them. Candice and I will have a little bit of a chat as to why that is and what we think we can do about it. And at that point, we'll have a pause and people can join in and say if that's something that they've encountered and any advice that they might have. So starting with data, the first thing I wanted to look at was the fate of data projects that did not go with us. And on the top here, you'll see the route that people took. And then if we go down, we see the outcome. So 60% of companies that we've spoken to over the last 5 years decided not to do a data project at all. It was deprioritized due to budget as the primary concern there. And interestingly, about 33% of those, so about a third of them, they go for a rapid state of growth. They spend their money, they grow as a company. And actually, they come back to us typically within 18 months to say, oh, we regret not doing data earlier because now we've wasted sort of money and time on things that didn't necessarily work. And if we'd had the data, that wouldn't have happened. About 10% of people use SaaS tools. So I'm primarily thinking of sort of all-in-one data tools that do the whole life cycle there. In the past, our advice was that these tools were a great way of getting started with data, that they can get you to value very quickly. But when I reviewed the data, I found that 100% of people actually look to change within 9 months. They hit a barrier very quickly in terms of what the tool can offer. It's not bespoke to them as a company. So maybe our advice needs to change on there and people should not use these SaaS tools. 10% went with a freelancer, and that's normally a good option for the sort of the first couple of years in business. But 45% of those companies then needed to start from scratch after 2 years just because the solution that was in place didn't scale enough. 6% went with an agency that wasn't us. And 20% of those people then came back later. They weren't happy with the agency and they hired us instead. I will say in the spirit of honesty that that's a trend that's only happened this year, didn't happen before this year. So perhaps that is AI has become a big selling point to companies. There's more agencies that are sprouted up because of that. And so maybe there's not as enough people in the industry that have experience of actually setting up data. And 5% hired internally, and that actually went really well for most of the companies that did that. But about 65% of them struggled, typically 2 to 3 years later, to onboard somebody new onto that data stack because that person was building in silo and because they weren't documenting. And then reflecting on if that was the true of industry. So budget is typically seen as the biggest obstacle to leveraging data. According to Big Data Wire, 43% of IT decision makers said budget was their biggest barrier. And even at enterprise level, 21% of them face cost-related barriers into implementing what they want with data. And so some key problems with starting with data. I've got a little chicken here, sort of a chicken and egg scenario starts where companies decide to focus their budget on growing as a company, which makes a lot of sense. But it leads to a lot of wastage as you scale. Very difficult to align ROI from data initiatives where the business strategy is not crystal clear yet, which tends to be the case if you're an earlier startup stage sort of companies. And then companies are building in a haphazard way, which means they incur quite a lot of technical debt later and they need to chop and change. And I'll pause there to bring in Candice.
Thanks, Oliver. 100%. I guess at the very beginning of a startup journey, there's so many things to do. There's so many things to build. It's very hard to prioritize data. And we always recommend, if you can't get onto the data stack just yet, like a modern data stack, have some data visibilities. Just send some top level signals. What you need is really having that feedback, the customer feedback. So, and as soon as you possibly can, put some effort into data, because you're not going to regret it. We have, like Oliver mentioned, also people regret not starting it quick enough. We don't have the other way around problems. No one regretted we started too early, unless there is a caveat there. If your underlying backend database is still changing, in which case it's good to wait for a little bit until that stabilizes. Yeah.
And I guess people on the call, we know that you're sort of beyond this stage, but is there any sort of things that ran true there? Is there any learnings in terms of how can people start with data and make sure that they grow efficiently?
I do agree, actually, that one of the biggest challenges for us was like coming up with an idea of where do we get the most value from and what do we do first. And I think even like 2.5 years later, we haven't entirely figured that out yet, because there's now so much stuff coming in that we could do that it's not super easy to say what's actually the most important given the resources that we have.
Interesting. Yeah, I think we hear that quite a lot. So in terms of our recommendations, we always look at things from strategy, technology, and people. So strategy-wise, we say nail down your business use cases by mapping out the customer journey as a good starting point. Technology-wise, when you're thinking about where do I start, what tools do I pick, if you know your data volumes, existing tech systems, think about security and data privacy, which will be dependent on which industry you're in. And then, of course, cost and scalability is probably the most important thing to think about. And from a people point of view, I guess our advice is don't try and hire a unicorn, one person who will do absolutely everything from you. They don't tend to exist, and they're quite expensive if they do. And it often leads to problems when scaling, because if you hire somebody who's stronger on analysis, they won't consider engineering and vice versa. Quote from one of our clients, Roy, here from Connected. He said, as a second-time founder, I knew how important it was to incorporate data much earlier in our journey and help deliver product market fit faster. And interestingly, a lot of our clients are actually second-time founders, which I think says an awful lot about when it's important to grow with data. So moving on to data strategy. Why did organizations come to us needing sort of strategic help? Here we've got problem and then the actual source of the problem, which didn't always align, which I found quite interesting. So about a third of people came to us because they weren't seeing value from data initiatives. And what we found in about 60% of those cases was that the initiatives that they were carrying out were just not aligned to business ROI. It tended to be that it was aligned to who was shouting the loudest internally as a business, or what was perceived as to be a hot issue that particular day, month, or year, or a lot of ad hoc work was being done. End users were just not using the data tool, was a case in about a quarter of the strategic problems. And a lot of the time it was that the wrong tools were in place, typically tools that were too complicated for business users to get their heads around, or that there was underlying inaccurate data, which meant that the business users did not trust the tools that they were seeing. They tended to blame the tools, which wasn't always accurate, but data trust was lost, and then people didn't use the tool at all. Companies had a really long data wish list in place, and the underlying problem was just everyone wanted to do everything at once. Everything was a priority, and in those scenarios, nothing was a priority. And then a messy and costly data stack was in place, so a real lack of data governance and processes in place, which meant that maintenance costs rose really quickly. It meant that a lot of initiatives weren't taking place that were more impactful because people were too busy sort of firefighting. So we saw alignment with business was the top problem in terms of strategy, and looking at industry stats. So about a quarter of people, 23.9%, only 23.9% had created a data-driven organization. So 75% of people in a survey of top 100 enterprise level have not done that. That number has actually gone down over the last 4 years. So when they did it 4 years ago, it was higher, and now less people are saying that they've got a data-driven organization. Maybe because of AI, they understand that there's a bigger gap there than they did before. And 71% of chief data officers struggle to influence the C-suite. And if your data is not influencing the decisions, it's not going to have an impact. So the key problems were lack of governance, documentation, and processes, or key contributors to messy infrastructure. Ad hoc data pulls and constantly firefighting new business requests without a clear process meant that data people aren't adding value to the bottom line. And every data initiative comes with time and resources in terms of ongoing maintenance costs, which is difficult to quantify and plan for. Once again, I'll bring in Candice at this point.
Thank you, Oliver. We'd love to hear Yannick and Tom your thoughts here. But 100%, if you don't align, I think the key thing is aligning business goals and data initiatives. Otherwise, you're constantly building things but not returning value, and then you get into a vicious cycle. You still have to firefight with ad hoc requests that you didn't think of initially.
I think our friends in IT have got this sort of quite well defined, in that if you have an IT request, that there's normally a form you have to fill in, there's a process behind that before they work on that. Should data teams consider that, or does that make them potentially quite transactional?
I guess the question leading up to that is, how many of those requests can be self-serviced? Typically, if you're not taking care of 90% of typical business questions in an automated way, you should start there. Then how does requests come to the data team? It doesn't really matter at the end of the day, as long as those requests are meaningful, not repeated. So if you're doing the same things twice, we used to have a saying, you need to automate it, because you're guaranteed to do it again, or someone else will need to do it again. And then how requests are raised, either it's Jira, either it's a ticketing system, that's all fine. That doesn't, it isn't a problem.
Cool. So our recommendations at the strategic level: ensure that you have clear business objectives and KPIs before trying to match with data. I do feel like sometimes we speak to companies that haven't quite got that aligned, and then we'll model the data and then they'll change later, which it just adds cost to that. From a technology point of view, self-hosting and custom elements add quite a big burden on your analytics teams in the long run. They seem to be free, which is why a lot of people do them, but actually at scale, it's an added cost, which is why we used to build a lot of custom Python extractors for people, and then we switched to telling people, hey, actually maybe use Fivetran as the first point of call, and then build something if that's not available there. And people-wise, be sure to involve your end users when selecting BI tools, dashboards, and that kind of thing, and consider what outputs are needed. There is obviously the most important thing. I'm just going to bring you back in here, Candice, because we've got a great quote here from Max at Newman. He said that ultimately data projects need to be aligned with the business, but it's not always easy to demonstrate ROI, particularly from foundational work, which is often needed to bring alive more complex projects later. That's a problem we have a lot of time, where we say, hey, you need to spend months to build this infrastructure to get the basics in place before you can do the sexy stuff that you really want. That's always a hard message to give to people. What's your advice at that?
What we've learned, I guess, in the 5 years is, where can we bring value within that process? So as we build a foundation, we always want to make sure we build towards a business use case. So that could be automating the leadership dashboard, automating investor reports, or as soon as end user can see something to demonstrate the data value, the better. So always think about where is the lowest hanging fruit with the biggest impact, and build towards that quickly. And while you're building that, set up the underlying pipeline. So do the work, spend the time, but make sure there's something tangible at the end of it.
Good stuff. Next section is tools and technology. So again, we've got the problems that people came to us with, and then we've sort of got the source down here. So slow dashboards is quite a common thing that people come to us with. And I feel like my first question whenever somebody says this is like, are you using the tool to model? And in a lot of cases, 70% of cases, that is the underlying cause. So I guess the main point here is that a lot of tools are trying to add features to sort of create this black box where everything is in one tool, but we don't recommend using the modeling within your dashboard. We recommend having a separate dashboard modeling tool that is primarily for that, and using dashboards just to bring the modeling to life, because typically the modeling that's available in those tools is quite basic. It doesn't really scale. Teams might not be able to work with them. So yeah, the common problem here was just using the in-tool modeling layer. Trying to integrate or extract niche data sources is another quite common problem that aren't available on Fivetran or Airflow or anything like that. So the common solution here was just building something custom Python extraction, but bearing in mind that that has an added an ongoing maintenance cost that's really difficult to attribute time to, because you don't control the end API and when that's going to update. No bespoke metrics. So a lot of companies, they hit a wall where they can't get to the meat of the conversation. They're not always able to find out where different metrics overlap. And again, this comes from a lack of a modeling layer. Weirdly, this year we've seen 3% of companies don't have modeling at all. We didn't encounter this before this year. It seems really odd that it's been one of the top things that we've encountered this year. So yeah, you need a modeling layer, I guess, is the learning on that. And last but not least, non-scalable solutions. I didn't want to name and shame any particular tools, but not all tools are created equal. So if you're struggling to scale a tool, maybe talk to us and I'll give you the dirt on which ones we don't like. So in terms of key problems there, scalability is probably the biggest obstacle. 90% of business level accounts, according to Dataversity, encounter scalability challenges. And a similar thing there is that 50% of people change their data tools because of a lack of scalability. So our key problems are that modeling is the core of your data pipeline. Be wary of these all-in-one solutions that promise you the world, which is really difficult because all of them promise the same things and they all advertise themselves as being able to do everything. Many tools offer free or low-cost plans to start with, but they encourage bad, by which I mean costly, behavior at scale. And data is a crucial business asset, and you should not be changing business tools every few years. Candice, Fran?
100% agree. Thanks, Oliver. I think we talked about data strategies before. So once we have that, then you should be guiding your modeling layer. So part of that data strategy, you should be nailing down your core KPIs, and then that should solve a lot of the problems that you talked about here, Oliver. So, and then costly tools, again, you requires that diligence. What are we trying to do here? What do we need to model? And making sure you don't bring in everything, be selective. That's how you're going to control the costs. And absolutely, data is such a crucial asset. You should be owning it, you should be growing it instead of rebuilding it every couple of years.
We have sometimes we have quite common scenarios where people come to us. One tool is suddenly very expensive. They think about changing to another tool or reformatting. And then because that tool is quite expensive and a lot of people are looking to move, the tool changes its pricing, Candice. And it's, when should people know when to ask that question? When should they consider migrating?
I guess really depending on the tool and the problem they're encountering. Sometimes people like to, dismiss a tool entirely. But sometimes it's a misuse of the tool. Sometimes the tool can do 50% of the things that you needed to do, and you need to shift off the rest of it to something else. So it's about a detailed look. I would say don't dismiss the tool immediately. I think, Oliver, you mentioned lots of people blame the dashboard, the reporting tool being slow. And sometimes the root cause isn't the reporting tool. So you really need to drill down to the bottom root cause of it, and then have a diligent way of resolving it, and not making a rash decision to say, okay, let's change to another reporting tool without having solved the underlying problem. Then you're going to encounter the same problem again. And then what do? You just change to another tool, but then likely 6 months effort gone without any data value.
I see Yannick is nodding furiously on this. Do you have anything to add to this, Yannick?
No, but I do feel like what you said rings very true, because I do remember that we had this question in the past where we said we might want to move away from Metabase, because there were a few people who said, like, back then said it can't do what I needed to. But then after like deep diving into what they were trying to do, it turned out that the tool itself wasn't really the problem. It was basically like no tool could ever create a graph as complex as you are trying to. And the issue is that you're trying to create this graph. Like, we should start with what you're trying to do and then see if that's even what you should be doing. And it turned out fairly quickly that the problem was the question the person had, not the fact that we used Metabase. So we did actually end up staying with it, and are still quite happy.
Great input there. So yeah, core recommendations here. Your business model and key priorities should be factored in when choosing tools. Certainly, if you are in a field where there are restrictions, you've got HIPAA compliancy that you need to think about, that will change the way that you choose your tools. From a technology point of view, we always recommend choosing a composable stack, and that scalability should be a key factor to consider. A lot of people, I think they think of cost first, and then they don't think about scalability. And then from a people point of view, consider how easy it is to hire people when choosing technologies, because niche tools are typically cheaper because less people are using them and they need more people to get on there. But then you struggle to find the people who know those tools, and stick to tools that rely on known languages. A lot more people know SQL than they know Python or R, for example.
Tom has some thoughts, right?
Oh.
Yeah, I wanted to ask your opinion on because I think one of the good things of like changing a tool is also that it kind of gives you a clean slate of where you are. And I feel that that's a big problem also. That, for example, in my case, the modeling layer, I kind of keep building on top, and then I have like hundreds of things that are useless and they just slow everything. And with the BI tool, it's the same. I've created like hundreds of dashboards that no one uses anymore. And even like worse, sometimes they are not updated. They use some old logic that doesn't apply anymore, but people still look at them and then they are like, oh, how is this number? And then the number is wrong though. So yeah, I just wanted to get your opinion on any advice on how you maintain and how you like kind of keep going back on top of everything we have to do to make sure we keep getting value out of it.
I think 100% there is a point that you need to start from scratch. We've seen that a lot, like a migration project, or we've seen companies with thousands of data models and lots of duplications. People don't know which version to use, number being inconsistent. And when you get to that stage, the easiest way is actually building from scratch. But when you build from scratch, it goes back to the things we talked about. What is the strategy and what is the core value for the business? And start from that and iteratively expand on that. And in the process of that, putting in governance, putting in data dictionary, version control, so you don't get into the same situation. We see this a lot, especially early stage startups. There's so many things to do. You need to constantly catch up with the business. So you're constantly building, or everybody is constantly building on top of each other. So you get to that stage, very understandably and very common. But then at some point, we do need to take a step back and look at how do we deal with this and how can we rebuild. And we would recommend starting from scratch at that point. You can migrate certain code, but you need to start with the core and then build on top. Again, starting from blank.
I have the stat on this. So 80% of the time when people are thinking of migration, we end up starting from scratch. I actually think that there's a really good point there, which migration projects in my mind are sort of the biggest wasted opportunity that we probably see, precisely because you have that chance to look at everything from a scratch. You've got a clean slate. But typically people just want to copy things into a new system, and I think strategically it's probably the biggest wasted opportunity you've got. But I also think it's quite difficult if you're an internal data person to say, hey, now I need to go back into this work that I've sort of already done, and just make sure that I'm refactoring it. Is a difficult conversation to have potentially. But if then you're not spending time on maintenance and you're not spending time with slow loading, which has cost implications because things get messy, then there is a business use case there, and saying, actually, we can save money if I refactor things. Got a great tool just on this section from Advika at MMC. She said, data tools are changing all the time. The thing to avoid are tools which claim to do everything. Find a suite of tools which are all excellent at their individual tasks and can easily be switched on. Last but not least, we've got people and processes. So once again, we've got the problem that people came to us with and the sort of underlying solution here. 79% of people are struggling to hire data professionals. And I think on my next slide, this aligns perfectly with what the industry is also saying. We know that demand for data people has outstripped the availability since 2016. So for the last half a decade, there's been way too many people looking for data people, but not being able to find them. And in about 70% of cases, what we found has actually worked is that you use external help to get you to a solution quite quickly, and then you can hand over to a smart mid-level person, as opposed to finding really senior people, which are really expensive, or as opposed to hiring junior people and then having to train them up. If you have an agency or external help or whoever you need to get in to get you to a solution quite quickly, you can normally hand over to mid-level person who will grow with the company and who is going to know your business use case as well. We always advise that internal people are the lifeblood of all analytics, and we never say that an agency can replace that. 32% of people had a problem with slow data adoption. We're primarily looking at sort of business use cases there, in terms of the problem tends to be a small centralized team, that they have multiple stakeholders, they have multiple people asking for things, and as we've already sort of talked about, then they have to build a load of stuff. All of that stuff needs maintenance, and they're not adding value. And typically we see the solution here is that you start to embed analytics within teams. So you have a data person within marketing, within finance, and so on and so forth. And they are sort of your first safeguard in terms of prioritizing data projects, in safeguarding people's time at that point. It is quite difficult normally to go from a small centralized team, especially if you're a standalone person, to doing things where you're embedding them in different teams and different departments, but that seems to be the most successful route. And then last but not least, just a general lack of data knowledge from business users. So this typically tends to be that they don't know what takes time. Data modeling is probably the number one thing where it's just like this dark art that people don't understand, that, hey, this is going to take 4 weeks. They just think, well, dashboards are really quick, and why can't I get that number there? And they don't understand all of the things that go into that and the QA process behind that. But if they do understand that, it can make a huge difference in terms of safeguarding time and making sure that the requests are sort of valuable to the business. And then the best solution for this is some sort of basic level of training. We also really like data champions, so people that don't necessarily need to know data inside in and out, but they know enough to be able to understand where the priorities are and what takes time. And I started my data journey as a data champion, as a marketer before, and then grew really interested in it. So that's where you find your future data people, because you find people who know the business side of things really well, and then if they can learn a bit about data, then they can be really valuable. So we see democratization in the industry is probably the biggest obstacle. Guiding Globant found that 69% of businesses do not have the talent to meet their goals, and only 20.6% have established data cultures within their business. So still 80% are missing that. Business users and data people don't always speak the same language, which is a huge problem. Centralized teams often become a blocker to decisions if everything needs to go through them. So they actually become a problem. They block agility as opposed to adding to it. It can be very difficult for companies to decide whether they should in-house or outsource data problems. Candice, right?
Yeah, again, 100%. In terms of the same language, speaking the same language, you touched upon, having training sessions. It is really communication. The more business people and data people can share ideas, discuss. Data people need to talk more about business. Like, they need to be more interested in where the business is going, and having people in the middle that is really helpful. That's typically analysts, very business orientated, or data champions within the business function. So someone like you, Oliver, in marketing, but really data savvy. So those are the connectors. So spot those. If you are, a sizable organization, make the most out of them. And then centralized versus decentralized teams, there's always a good debate which way you should go about it. There's pros and cons of both. A hybrid approach is actually, where we see the best. So you have data teams, in the structural kind of way. They're in one team. They can share best practices. They share the same code base. So you don't build duplications. So if there's a model already existing, let's expand on that. But then have the data people embedded in terms of business functions. So if you're a data analyst, you're embedded into the finance team. You have a data analyst embedded to the marketing team. So it is centralized, but yet at the same time, they're embedded. So that's where we see. But then again, every organization is different. So experiment to see what works the best. When to in-house, when to outsource. This is a great, debate. But things that you need fast-tracked, you need very unique experiences that probably one-off. That's always a good place to outsource. Get things up and running really quickly, and then you can train, like you said, a really smart mid-level data person, and this person can grow into like head of analytics and can help the business day in, day out. As an agency, we're not going to be there day to day. So you really need someone owning this piece from the inside. And this person typically start as a analytics lead or a data analyst, and they quickly grow into head of analytics or director of data. So we see that a lot. And that point, having an external agency to help in terms of specific questions, strategic input, that could be a good way to go about it. And it's the most, time and cost-effective way for companies.
I was very surprised when I looked through it. So there was literally a 50-50 split on people deciding to in-house or outsource analysis or engineering. Is there one of those things that makes more sense than the other?
Again, depends on the use case. Engineering more so, I would say, because we call it, our VP of engineering, Adrian, always call it the data plumbing. And with data plumbing, you'll need to plumb once, right? Once it's set up, you just have to maintain it. It becomes a lot easier. So if you're setting up new data sources, especially the tricky one, it makes sense to bring in outside help. Do it once, and it's always there, so you can make the most out of it. Data analysis, it's good to get an agency in to help you structure how to approach a particular analytics problem, but it's typically something you should do in-house, because an in-house analyst would understand your problem. They're there day in, day out. They can, poke the business to say, hey, I need an actual piece of information to complete my analysis. So I would say engineering is probably more of a situation, engineering, and then analysis, unless you're looking at LTV predictions, those large-scale analytical problems, then it's probably better done in-house.
Great stuff. So our recommendations on this: build your analytics capability iteratively and expand resources in line with customer growth, because that makes the most sense. On a technology front, think of fun ways such as hackathons or challenges, so that people can better learn your tool set. Training sessions can be quite dull, and people see it as an addition to their job and not necessarily part of their core role. So any fun way of doing that, I think, is really important. Befriend marketing to display that information in an interesting way. And on the people side of things, documentation and best practices are key when growing your team in a sustainable way. You need somebody else to come in who's completely new and has never seen your code before and understand it really quickly. But this is probably the key area that gets skipped when we see it scale. We'll just end on a quick quote from Christian at Rivery. He said, we got a lot of value working with agencies. They bring in expertise we don't have quickly and cost effectively. The key is to help onboard to our business goals. And that has been our sort of core learnings from 5 years and literally over 400 different clients and prospects that we've looked into when we've asked the question of what happened. I guess at this point, we'll open it up to any sort of final questions or any kind of thoughts.
Nice. Thanks, guys. There's a lot to learn from here. Yeah, thanks for that. I have actually like one question. Something that I actually struggle sometimes is kind of, so at the end I think of myself as kind of the product manager of data, and like my customers are my coworkers at the end. And I have a bit of a, so I see a bottleneck sometimes in kind of the deliverability of the insights or the data, or like kind of the go-to-market of the data. So like I spend all this time building this super awesome dashboard, and then it's kind of like I throw it out, and then people is super busy doing their things, and that kind of stays nowhere. Or I spend 2 days looking and find this super good insight, but at the end, no one like kind of. So sometimes this happens that I spend a lot of time on getting some data, but that data doesn't send the message across. So I just thought it, I don't know, did you have any advice for that, for improve the storytelling, the go-to-market of data and that stuff?
There's one thing we used to do is like a data block. That could be, on that front is really, once you describe something that's happening, so that's usually the outcome of an analysis, so this is what's happened, give it some hypothesis to say, you know, based on the product, the behaviors of the user, we think this might be what's happening, and give them some suggestions. So let's say if you're doing a marketing analytics analysis, you know, so you find the top campaigns, maybe give them some, you know, try to change the creatives, or, you know, this is how our customer behave. A type of creatives may be different types, you know, maybe a group of children might be a bit more because we have parents, you know, majority in our users. So you give them some action points, give them some suggestions why this is happening, and that always prompt the conversation. Because you're right, you know, data can be a bit dry. You know, if you serve them up, this is the numbers, they'll be like, oh, okay, that's very interesting, but is that connection to how do I act on it? You don't be afraid to give them a hypothesis that's completely wrong, but that's the point of hypothesis, is to test it out, get people interested, get people talking, get people giving you feedback to say, oh, this is very interesting, but this is something else I've seen. So that's the one side. And then the other, it's we always like to ask about the challenges in people's day-to-day lives. So, you know, if you're doing a marketing analytics or product analytics, what is that thing that keep them up at night? What do they need? It could be, I have drop-offs, you know, in the onboarding funnel. And then, you know, all of a sudden you can frame your analysis in a way that, okay, there's a drop-off here, and this is what we found. So always address the issue that people have and go from there, instead of describing this is what happened, but start with the problems people have. So that's what we found quite useful. Oliver, do you have thoughts? And Yannick, do you have thoughts in your day-to-day?
One thing that I've sort of seen recently that I really like is, do you know Spotify Wrapped? If you use Spotify, they give you this like little presentation that says, oh, here's your top artists for this quarter and all this kind of stuff. I've seen a lot of data teams starting to do the same thing. So they have a little sort of presentation that they send out that says, hey, this month we integrated HubSpot and we found that 400 customers only use us for this service and this kind of thing. And it's a really nice sort of soft way of just reminding people in the business, hey, now you can make this decision better and without having to sort of go to somebody in marketing and say, well, this campaign hasn't improved, why haven't you changed the messaging here, which can be a little bit confrontational. It's just sort of saying, hey, you've now got this data that you can make a decision. So I really like that as a use case, and like, how can you present the information in a slightly different way? And I think it works because they're sending it to everybody in the organization. So it's nice and soft way of sort of poking people like, hey, why are you not using this data? Or to make your boss think, oh, now they can look at this, and why are they not improving this, without you having to be direct to that person.
Yeah, I'm actually doing something similar in the All Hands of the company. We're still a small company, so I actually try to always get my 5 minutes in the All Hands to present some interesting insight or something like that. So that's proven quite successful. It always sparks some discussion. So it's always something that people is interested in if you phrase it the right way.
I think everything goes, data to decisions. And so the question is always, well, what decisions did you make? And was there an improvement? But it's very difficult sometimes to follow up with somebody 6 months later to say, hey, we had this data, you've improved something. What was the outcome? Because unless you're actively monitoring every single thing that you've done and what was the outcome and what's the business approach, it's a little bit difficult. But also, for your own job and for your own, hey, getting value from data, that's kind of what you need to do, which even we as an agency struggle with. Cool. Any last thoughts, Yannick, before we sort of wrap up and call it a day?
Not really. So I also like, again, lots of the things that you spoke about rang really true with me, and it is good to see, I guess, that we're not the only people who have these questions and these issues. I do feel like it's really interesting that as you grow and like also as you mature and as you start addressing these issues, for example, as you start building like a data culture, as people start adopting the things that you build, it's not necessarily becoming any easier to balance all of it. It's just becoming more complex, and you start having people ask more complex questions, which is good because that means that they're really adopting what you give them, but it also means that you need to figure out how do you deal with that. Like, we have 10 teams who are now all basically requiring time from us, which is really nice. I'm seeing how the data, like the data as a topic has grown, but it also means that you have to identify what that means for you as a data team. And yeah, it was just really interesting to see what people typically come to you with. And I also definitely took some learnings. So thank you.